we're Resolve, we're an interdisciplinary design collective, and we look between architecture, art, engineering, and technology to address social challenges in the built environment. A lot of our work looks at this idea of using site as a resource, and that manifests itself in two different ways, really. The first is the kind of valuing of tacit and local knowledge, how we can engage with design processes that do that. And the second is understanding and kind of tapping into flows of local materials and working with that. And so we're going to present a few from our projects that I feel have some resonance with teaching, which is something that we also do, especially for children of the target age, and how we can also use classroom materials and everyday materials as well to kind of aid in that process. So without as an overview, our kind of design work manifests itself both physically, so that's usually with the creation of temporary spaces, but also in the form of workshops. So we see design as a process rather than a product. And for us, it's much more important to engage people equitably in the design process in ways in which they can reimagine their built environments and kind of engage themselves within much wider frameworks of urban planning, of policy, of urban governance as well. So that's a really central figure to the work. Yeah, so learning from the city. Seth, I think that's you now.
Hi. So the first project that we'd like to take you through is a project that we had in 2019 up in Sheffield at a gallery called S1 Art Space, and the project was called The Garage. Move to the next slide. So like all of our projects, we like to set a precedent, and the reason why we're reflecting on this is the idea that we were learning from the city. So Sheffield is a city that we were extremely unfamiliar with. I'd only visited it once, and Akil had never been. And we wanted to try and think about an entry point into the city and into the themes that we wanted to explore in our exhibition. And I think we arrived at this after a train conversation, but we wanted to try and think about how different people experience the city in different ways. And we arrived at a theory by a man called Kevin Lynch. And what he did was, this is called the citizen image. And what he was doing was comparing maps from different demographic groups in LA. So going from left to right, the first is a group of a group of white people from Westwood. In the center was an African American community, and then on the far right is a Latino community. And what you can see that this is a kind of completely imaginary mapping exercise where you try and draw your city based on your memory. And you start to see the different restrictions that are felt based on different demographic lines. And that was one of the ways that we wanted to enter this topic. So we go to the next. So what we did was we developed our own version of this mapping exercise, which was not based as much around imagination as it was around experience. So we printed out A3 maps, I think, for we had 3 different workshops. One we ran with a residence group, the other we ran with in fact we ran it with 2 secondary schools, so with kids aged 16 to 18. And what we wanted to do was create an emotional map for their city. So we set out a few different questions which identified things like, where's your area, what do you consider your neighborhood, what are some of the physical markers, but then also what are some of the emotional markers that define your city. And this was a way for us to actually learn a lot more about the city that we were dealing with, so that whatever we were to deliver within the space responded or reacted or reflected people's relationship with Sheffield. So these are just some of the maps that were created, and it was a really amazing exercise just to understand how cities are experienced based upon age, upon ethnicity, upon class. So it was a kind of really positive exercise for us, and what that did was it framed how we wanted to work with the space. If you go to the next one. So another thing it did as well is it kind of gave us a bit of visual stimulation. So we looked at the maps and we looked at some of the formations that were forming and some of the patterns that were forming within the map, and that helped us create a visual identity for the space. If you go to the next. So what was also important is that this space was situated right in a kind of a very contested site within Sheffield. So S1 Art Space is in Park Hill Estate, which is a really famous estate. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that estate. If they're familiar with the North, it's a very famous estate that's had its own kind of quite complicated journey through history. And we wanted to, as Akil has mentioned already, use the site as a resource, as well as using people's input from the maps and from their experiences as a resource. So what we did was we used recycled material from art galleries and institutions across Sheffield to try and get a kind of a material response to some of the things that we were thinking and some of the themes that were arising through the mapping exercises. So what came out of that was a space that was divided into 6, and each element or each area responded to a different way people experience the city. So moving from organisation and how we organise in the city, to narrating and storytelling and memory and how we reflect on the city, to performances and those kind of individual performances that we do throughout our lives, to movement, so how we move through the city, and finally data and analysis and looking at some of the data that sits behind our urban experience. So we set out the space, and that was how we responded to it physically, but we also at the same time wanted to respond to it programmatically. So with all of our projects, with a lot of the projects, especially the ones that we have jurisdiction over the space, we always try and create a programming element. So we created an 8-week program in which each week we wanted to explore one of those themes as specified. So, and in order to do that, we wanted to team up with local creatives, local community groups, local artists, musicians, to do a mixture of different things. It ranged from workshops to talks to performances to screenings, each of which was exploring these different elements. And so that the program and the physical space managed to respond to this entry point that we wanted to in order to explore the city. And the next one, and these are just some images of how it kind of came together. So this was the structure that responded to organisation. So it was called Public Bodies and Organisation, and what we wanted to do was create a format that people could feel the kind of the physical implications of public bodies and organisations and the effect that they have on the human body. Not only that, it was a central meeting point. So it was the place that we used to host most of the big events within the space, and it was a place that was kind of the central focus of the space as well. And then this was another one of the areas that we wanted for mapping. So the mapping exercise was tested with those first 3 groups, but we wanted to continue and get more and more maps. So we invited everyone who came into the space to contribute to the map and in some way contribute to the space and our understanding of the city as well. And this was movement. So these foam structures were created in collaboration with one of the schools that we worked with originally. So what we did was we wanted them to think about different ways that you move through your city, and we took photos on their phone on a long, I think it's a long frame is what I'm going to call it, and it created this kind of this image, this perception of motion, and we wanted them to create a sculpture that related to that perception of motion. So they were looking at individual moments within their day and how they might be able to create an installation that responds to that movement through the city. And this was about narrating, where we printed out a lot of stories and memories that we picked up along the way. So through our research, but also through conversations, and some of those conversations were conversations that we had with people very close to us. Like our mum actually grew up in Sheffield, and she gave us a really interesting reflection on her own experience and an experience that she had with another Afro-Caribbean family. And this kind of progressed through a load of different stories. This was the performance area, so this was responding to the idea of performance in the city, but we wanted to create a space that meant that there was no distinction between the performer and the audience. So it's kind of one interrelated platform. So what we did was we marked out the stage on the floor without raising it and without drawing any other distinctions between it, so that the audience could really immerse themselves in this performance. And this was for narrating. So this was a group called I Saw Magazine, who did a deep listening and conversational workshop where they reached out to a load of different groups within Sheffield and asked them to participate in a workshop that they had planned. And then these are just some nice photos of the space being used and the space being active through various events that we had across the summer. And then the final thing I think is just almost harking back to the point that Akil made around the site being a resource, but we made sure that the materials that we used were kind of a bit of a currency to the space. So this was recycled insulation foam from another gallery, and what we used them for was mobile seating, so that people could move through those different sectors of the space without feeling like they were restricted to one area or another, and so that it could get the kind of the full experience, because each space kind of responded to one another. We didn't want people to be static in the space. And then the second is learning from learners. So this is a project that we delivered in Hull with an organisation called Absolutely Cultured, who are a continuation of the UK City of Culture 2017, I think. And here we designed a curriculum and an installation working with local school children in Hull. And what this did was we divided up actually very similar. We divided up how we kind of experience and respond to our city into 4 different themes. So relating to transport, shopping, care and maintenance, and health. And we wanted to create a curriculum where we could explore those themes with the kids, but also learn from them so that we could then project that into an installation that children across Hull could understand. So this is just a snapshot of the administrative tasks that went around it. So we wanted to make sure that the learning was super immersive. So so what we did for an example of that is for the first workshop, we put on a thing called a carers fair, where we reached out to loads of different people who worked in different professions that we thought in some way responded to this idea of care and maintenance in the city. So parks officers, people who worked for Thames Water, ambulance drivers, policemen, the kind of people that support the kind of health of the city. And we arranged them to come in, and we did almost like a kind of false careers fair for the children, where they could interview the people and understand what it is they do and how what they do responds to the themes that we presented to them in the first place. So these are just some photos of the workshop, and as I said, it was super hands-on but also very immersive. So for the shopping experience, we took them on little tours of different high street shops, because we wanted them to understand how high streets affect the city, and how some cities, especially Hull, have kind of almost built or how important high streets are to those cities, and what they might do if they were to think about high streets in a different way. And then this is another one with this is about health in the city. So when we were doing this, we drew out a very basic map of Hull on the floor with chalk, which obviously didn't go down well with the parents afterwards, but it was a nice messy experience. But we wanted them to draw different kind of health points or different things that they associate with health and unhealthy cities. So it ranged from the obvious parks to kind of food places to schools and to relationships as well. So we always take this kind of approach. We wanted to understand what is out there in order to intervene. And then if you go to the next one. These are just some close-up images of some of the things that the kids were drawing. Keep going to the next. And you'll see this trend runs through a lot of our projects, but we always try and be as kind of exploitative with materials. So we don't just want to talk to them, we don't just want them drawing, but we try and use different materials wherever we can, and use recycled materials wherever we can. So these are actually boxes that we used in an installation previous that we took up to Hull, and we decided that when we were exploring traffic and parking and transport, we actually wanted to look at not just the cars and the trains and what moves you through a city, but the space that's taken up by those things. So in order to do that, we wanted them to create their own little interventions in these spaces. So imagining what the city might look like, or what it might be like if you were to use some of the spaces that are currently taken up by cars. And then throughout, there was a sound designer called Dan Jones who put together a sound installation. So he was recording some of the kids' feedback, and that was going to be projected onto a high street in Hull. So that's what the overarching project was, this thing called Model City, where the kids were almost explaining to the people of Hull what their model city of the future would be like. So as I said, this was all going to then be projected into a space that could be enjoyed and experienced by kids across the city, not just kids who were experienced in the workshop. So we had to take what they almost taught us about their imagination and their learning experience and create a space that responded to that and enabled others to experience the same thing. And these are just some pictures of the kids as they were experiencing the space. So we had different components. We had components where they could read different books that in some way explored like the architecture of Hull or kind of transport in Hull. We had different activities. We had, if you go to the next, I think. So we had a video where they could look back on what was done in the workshop. If we go to the next one. Yeah, we had kind of activities where they could write on little postcards to a future self. So the same way that the kids were going through that like imaginary process, all of the kids who visited the space could do the same thing and think about what would their city of the future be. And I don't know if you can see on the walls, we wanted to recreate these little mini parking spaces that in some way reflected the work that the kids did in creating these parklets. And yeah, finally on the left-hand side, these are mini shop fronts that we used recycled carpet tubes to make shop fronts that we could hang up some of the kids' designs of future shops. And also people who entered the space, kids who entered the space could think about their own future shop and hang it up on the wall. And then at the back, there's a stock of a few models. So the final activity that the kids did on day 5 was incorporating all of the themes that we'd thought about. What would they do if they were to design their own city from the ground up, a city that was only experienced by children? And they came up with all kinds of wacky ideas, and we wanted the kids of Hull to be able to do the same. So we provided them with the material and they had some instructions, and then they got to participate in the same activity.
So the third project we'd like to show is goes along the theme of learning from reflection, and this is a project that we did earlier last year in Braunschweig in Germany for the Kunstverein there. It was a project that was based upon the life of a Ghanaian German philosopher from the 18th century called Anton Wilhelm Amo, who was just been the center of a really large and impressive renaming subject in Berlin, renaming process in Berlin this year, taking over the previous kind of pejoratively named street Mehrstrasse, and it being renamed Amo Wilhelm Amo Strasse. So that was a kind of really quite historic point that the collective exhibition we're involved in actually led some way to kind of solidifying. So that was really a really interesting way of playing a part of that. For this project, we decided to look into our own method of investigation as a way of putting ourselves within the text. It's a way in which of making things highly personal to us in terms of how we were able to research the subject, how we were able to understand both Wilhelm Amo's theories and his life as well, and his life biography. And we then sought to split that into 3 separate themes that the space would encapsulate. The first was an archive of the readings and the research materials that we had been through, but a way of framing that so people could enjoy and kind of indulge in some of those readings. The second was a programming aspect of the space, but rather than one that brings it to life, one in which is an impassive way of programming, a way of inviting people to reflect, of inviting people to think and to kind of consume material rather than inviting people to perform, which is something that we usually do when it comes to programming. And then the last, and I think the most important for this particular talk, was how we tried to translate what were actually quite esoteric and complicated philosophies into quite tangible, hands-on and exciting building materials. So what we did was we took 4 elements of his philosophies, and Amo was a dualist, so by which he believed in the philosophy of the separation of mind and body, and we turned those into 4 different methods through which we could turn reclaimed materials into two separate end forms. And we workshopped that with a group of 40 students from the local art school in Braunschweig. And this we embarked upon a process by which we could turn these materials into their end forms, but doing that in an experimental way. So we played with both the kind of construction of the space and the testing of those materials through this workshopping form, allowing people to kind of get involved in that. For obvious reasons, due to coronavirus, the project had to take a digital turn, but this gave us a new kind of lease in how we were able to investigate some of these spaces. We ended up taking the research project much deeper and looking at the life of the Black diaspora within Europe between the 16th and 19th century, which is of course really revelatory to us in terms of how we center Black life in Europe today. We exported the methods that we were talking about before and that we had tested and developed with the school children from Braunschweig, and we turned that into a manual through which people from their homes could test and also develop those materials too. We developed an online site through which we put a library of the materials and the readings that would have previously been available in the physical space for all to see, but a way of which people can navigate those spaces or those materials intuitively rather than having to read their way through them. And we developed the program, but in a digital space as well. And now, luckily, because of Germany kind of opening up much quicker than us, we were able to actually build the space remotely, employing some of these material aspects, but opening out the space in such a way that people could join in the building of the space as well, and kind of rehearse those material techniques as well. So, for example, the frame at the back is wooden joints all connected by heated plastic, which is a technique we use on leftover plastic as a way of creating the space. But in front of that is the desk through which you can also continue those techniques and continue to build and take home some of the things that you've done as well. So the space kind of played with this idea of opening up the activity for all, but whilst inviting people also to be there and to reflect as well. And here are just some more images from the space and the different kind of material techniques that we use to construct it with the school children. An important part of this construction as well was that it was done through WhatsApp, and I think one of the lessons that we've learned in quite a powerful way from this is that the digital that our kind of consumption by the digital realm at present doesn't necessarily mean that we're estranged from the physical realm, and actually building remotely and having and continuing these dynamic, reciprocal and iterative methods of building can be done over platforms as easy and as kind of simple to use as WhatsApp. The fourth project we'd like to go through is called is a lesson we'd like to frame as learning from collaboration, and that's something that we did with the young leaders, the Science Gallery Young Leaders in London, which were a young steering group of people between the ages of 16 and 25 at the Science Gallery in London Bridge. They were very keen to explore this idea of anxiety as being a dual phenomena, both something that's neurological, so in our minds, and something that's experienced collectively and culturally, especially by diaspora in London. We worked with them over numerous iterations to think about what the nexus or where those two experiences of anxiety conjoined, and we kind of collectively arrived at a point of thinking about it being something that's physical. So being something that can be worked with and worked around in physical ways, but something that's also a kind of inherently physical experience, drawing on research that we'd also worked with researchers at King's on the plasticity on how anxiety affects the plasticity of the brain. We commenced a series of workshops by which we use a technique that turns old t-shirts into reconstituted yarn, and using old t-shirts from the local area, which was between Bermondsey and London Bridge, and t-shirts from charity shops, we turned the space into a series of loom walls by which we were weaving fabrics taken from different diasporic markets around London, from Shepherd's Bush to Brixton to Ridley Road in East London, and constructed the space through which participants and users of the space could weave and could both weave and unweave in a physical process that reflected how anxiety is experienced in this dual way, but also worked some way towards dealing with the anxieties of the users themselves. And so here's just some pictures of the detailing. And as the space grew, it became messier and it started to kind of take on this form that embodied the kind of collective experiences of people. So starting from quite a clean and kind of unified space to a space in which it showed and traced some of the movement and the activities that constructed it. We also ended up working with a youth group based in Brixton called the Latin American Youth Forum, by which they worked on their own loom, and one that reflected their kind of histories and their experiences of cultural anxiety in the UK. This we frame as learning from the word, and this is a project that embodies something that's quite important to us about how we, as built environment professionals and people who are generally thought of as making space, how we learn and how we take from words, and how important the idea of written word and the production of written words are to architecture and urban design in the built environment. So this is a project that we did with Corumsfield Youth Centre in Camden, working at the ISOR print fair at the London Building Centre last December. And we looked at a series of radical newspapers and prints that have affected neighbourhoods, from the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent to contemporary scenes like Skin Deep, The Collective, and others, and how these collectives document their highly personalised experiences of their neighbourhoods, but also what it means to be in control of your own of printing and your own text and your own way of telling your story. So we worked on a method of printing based on the a technology that was used in an old form of printing called hectographs, by which you use gelatin plates to reproduce prints onto other sheets of paper. I think it's sometimes also called a mimeograph, and which was a kind of popular form of duplication in schools up until a few decades ago. So we worked with the students to make zines and kind of prints that reflected their neighborhood and their paths, telling their own stories, and then worked with them through that technique so that they were able to do their prints, and they ended up selling those prints, collecting them as kind of prints and selling them at the fair. We've since worked again and with this method in various ways, and also worked to refine it so it's used as agar, which is a kind of seaweed substitute for a gelatin. Learning from the site is another kind of way in which we've sought to use the site as a resource, both materially but also in a kind of human resource way. This is a project that we have recently finished called Close from Afar. So this project was something we finished only a few weeks ago, in fact, maybe a week ago, so it's still quite fresh in our minds. But the project involved, we were interested in understanding the global as a collection of locals, and what those tangible connections are between people who live in local areas and the kind of rest of the world. So we worked with a number of different kind of community groups in the area and set up a 3-day festival, or a 3-day public program of events that platformed some of these initiatives alongside other citywide initiatives, but also worked using construction waste from the site, which was the Design Museum, so the Design District in Greenwich, and using this construction waste to build a number of different seating elements in the space, and that became the kind of platform for this public program. Working with volunteers from the University of Greenwich, we did we had a similar iterative method of design and development throughout the building process, working with them very closely and collaboratively to change and iterate based on the rhythms of the construction site. So based on the kind of abundance or the scarcity of certain materials and offcuts, we've developed with them collaboratively different ways of thinking about seating. So here are examples of some seating that we use with recycled materials and recycled dust netting from scaffolds, also off-cut bricks, old OSB, and here's some photos of how the space also worked to frame the construction site behind it. And yeah, so it's just the various seating elements and a public program through which we were lucky enough and fortunate enough to have some really fantastic performers, film screenings and talks as well. The penultimate project we'd like to show is something that we frame as learning from experience. And so this is a project and one of the kind of multiple ones that we had to take digitally in terms of during lockdown and during the coronavirus. So this is a project we were commissioned by a group called Breakline from UCL, from University College London, to reflect on our experience of working with large institutions. And so in order to do that, they commissioned us to do an essay, but we felt like it was more appropriate to design a online game. So using an application called Bitsy, we designed an online game that framed the experience of 3 institutions which we had worked with, one being cultural institutions, the second being local authorities, and the third being universities. And so using kind of a mix of kind of really whimsical dialogue, but also fun and bright settings, we used the Bitsy emulator to design a game through which someone would take themselves through that experience, conversing with different people within those institutions, and reflecting both the tensions, but also the kind of everyday conversations and the everyday natures of these institutions that we often prefigure as kind of out of our hands. And why I thought it was important to show this one today as well was that the Bitsy emulator, although seemingly quite complex, is actually a really fun and easy tool to use. And it's something that we've continued to try and work on with the students that we teach as well, and something that I think could be really important and really fun to also work with younger children as well. Oh, and that wasn't penultimate, actually, that was the final, sorry, that's it.
Thank you so much. We've had a few questions come in. I'm going to kick off with one that I've prepared before, which relates back to the emotional mapping that you spoke about. So I think that would be such a great activity if teachers are sort of starting to think about either introducing students to the themes of home or community, about how they can start thinking about students' own experiences of their local area. And I wonder if there are sort of any other ways that you've encouraged young people you've worked with to value their knowledge of their own experience or their local area, and any other methods you've used that have helped young people sort of find problems that they want to solve based on their sort of experiences.
So we've worked in a number of different ways in order to do that. So a lot of our projects involve, like you said, like working with young people to value their kind of knowledge of the built environment. Sometimes, for example, in Sheffield, that comes in the form of mapping. So in mapping, and in the act of mapping and kind of validating those experiences and that tacit knowledge that young people have of their built environment, we were also able to work towards a kind of tangible design that animated the space you saw with the intervention. But in other ways, we worked in more kind of subtle ways with younger people. An example is a workshop at Loughborough Junction that we ran a few years ago, which is called Sight and Sound, thinking about how the sound affects and kind of works in tandem with our built environment and with design of our built environment. And we worked with groups of young people to design spaces that were influenced by the sounds that they heard and that they were familiar with around their local areas. And so what we encouraged them to do was to delve into sounds that weren't particularly exemplary, and to sounds that weren't things that were kind of out of the ordinary, but things that were really familiar to them and things that were very personal to them. And I think by encouraging people, especially young people, to use experiences that are familiar as adults and as professionals, in that act we're also validating those experiences and validating, and by validating I mean kind of approving the value or showcasing the value of those experiences. I think we've also worked in much more long-form ways when we're doing strategic work with local authorities, in which we work, and when we're working with young people, that's a process in which we're able to think about and include some of those reflections from young people into wider strategic aims, such as master plans and policy and recommendations, as ways of kind of ways that will affect the built environment in a much longer term way.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful to think about, I guess, more of the senses and how we could get people to think about what they experience through their senses. I've got a question here, which I think is general to your whole presentation. With these projects, how do you ensure that you achieve the goals you set in advance?
So I think, even though the way when we've delivered them, it seems like there's a really kind of goal-orientated focus. There's kind of not, like, we know that we like to work with people, we know that we like to work with young people, we know that we like to work with certain communities, and we try and take a more like explorative approach to our work. So with Sheffield, our aim was to create a space that people could enjoy. That was really our aim, and to kind of get to understand the city and to get to work with interesting people and get to kind of collaborate with interesting people. And I think we managed to do that at every stage, but that was purely by putting ourselves out there and making sure that we were trying to make as many connections as possible. I think with the kind of work that we do, it's probably hard to set ourselves goals at the beginning, to be honest with you. I think it's hard to say that we're entering a project to achieve certain goals. Maybe the whole example, because it was part of a wider project in which we needed to get these sound bites, and we needed to think about how we were going to create a space. It's probably for us to try and ensure that we facilitate that to happen. But yeah, I think it kind of differs from each project. I'm not sure if Akil's got any thoughts on it either.
Yeah, I mean, just to emphasize that, I think the often because of our kind of really strident belief of design being a process, we try not to structure the project in a goal-orientated way. So we don't start with the end focus being a kind of goal to be reached. But often it's a question to be asked, and so what we start off with is a setting. We often have a site. It might be a physical location or a collection of different locations, kind of parameters with which we set ourselves, and therefore restrictions which we have to work with and amongst. But then that process is really iterative. So to take the last project that we did in North Greenwich, the final design for that changed every single day, and that was largely because we only had limited access to the construction site, and could only be there for certain times and health and safety and all the things, but the construction site also changed all the time. So the construction site would often have a plethora of materials one day and no materials the next, and no of those certain materials the next. And we had to work with that, and that became something that was embedded in the final design. So I think if we had a goal-oriented process, we would often end up disappointing people who were convinced of that original goal. With a more open-ended process, what we're trying to do is convince people of the process itself, and convince people that a final resting point as being a question to be asked, as in something that you ask of your own practice, something that we ask of the wider site, is completely legitimate in design.
Great, thank you. I think this is a question about the Hull project. How did the listeners respond to hearing about the experience of the Afro-Caribbean community?
Yeah.
Go on, Seth.
No, I was going to say I don't quite understand. Is that related to Sheffield when we did the mapping, or is it related? I don't quite understand the
Sheffield one, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually don't really understand, because when we did if it's about the mapping exercise, they were all like, people were shocked every time they walked in the room to look at the maps, but that was the point of them, because they had the ability to, well, actually, in fact, it was mostly because they went against, or they were contrary to people's perceptions of their city, and that was the point of them. So they're an example of like massive generational divide across how we understand and experience our city. An example was we did it with a residents group who were on average, I would say, kind of 45 and above, and they spoke about this shopping centre called Meadow Hall, and they used to call it Meadow Hell. And all of the young people we did the workshop with all went there every weekend, and they loved it. And I think that was our aim. If that answers the question, I don't know.
But I think it's also about the deep listening one as well. So like for I think with the deep listening one, that was as much as revelation to us as well. So for example, the story that we had on there was the story that our mama told us, which was about our grandparents who, coming to Sheffield, not knowing any other Afro-Caribbean people, went onto the bus, and they were taking the bus down to where they were going in Nether Edge, and they bumped into another Afro-Caribbean couple, quickly made friends with them over the journey of the bus, and ended up being their best man and woman at the wedding, and bridesmaid at the wedding, purely because they didn't know anyone else. Like kind of 60 years on, they're still in contact, and the children are still in contact with one another. And that was a story that we had framed, and I think that was trying to feed into this. Sheffield struck us as something, as a place that was a city of stories. It has these really, really familiar stories: the story of football, the story of industrialization, and a number of others as well, other smaller ones that are kind of tightly woven into its mythology. But the ones that you heard less of, that were just as important, were kind of stories of gender, stories of ableism, stories of race. And these stories were stories that, these were stories that people from Sheffield also felt were extremely important. And I think like bringing them to light in that space just allowed that to become more of a discussion. And also, it was very much a journey of discovery for us. But I think the discussions I had were really kind of revelatory. So I'd say they acted well, maybe.
Thank you. I think that definitely answered the question. Thanks. Got one here about materials. So are using recycled materials, environmental approaches a mandatory element of your projects and process? And do you feel this alters the outcomes in any way?
Yeah, it means we can't sell the projects for thousands of pounds afterwards, unfortunately. It means the projects just end up like, just becoming other projects. I wouldn't call it mandatory I wouldn't call it mandatory because, well, it probably is. It probably is, but I wouldn't. It's not so, like every time we set out, we say, okay, everything has to be recycled. I think we were saying this a little bit earlier in another thing, that we never really used the term recycled ourselves, especially when pitching a project. And a lot of the use of materials, this kind of way of reuse and upcycling, is something that we've inherited from our kind of cultures, and something that Seth and I, come from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, and when we used to go back to Jamaica, it's something that you kind of see as an everyday practice. And I think that was a starting point. So that was kind of where we started. But now that's very much taken on a number of different identities, one of which is an accessibility to materials. And I think by using recycled materials, you create this atmosphere of accessibility that kind of using bought and acquired materials just doesn't have. There's an equitability to it as well that other materials don't have. By using materials that are kind of found, that have been used before, you invite as many people as possible into that design experience. You don't limit people out by by financial restraints, which I think is really important. And you also encourage a way of people to understand their familiarity with different things. So sometimes the materials aren't just recycled. There's a lot of some recycled / eco-friendly things that we don't use, but often the materials are very familiar. So often they're things that you would have just seen in the day-to-day and paid absolutely no attention to. And kind of bringing that into the design process, I think, is mandatory.
This is back on the back to sort of mapping idea. It's got a question from Liam saying that the mapping idea is really interesting. Are there any other successful strategies that you use with young people to help generate creative thinking that might work well with students in a classroom setting? Yeah,
I think increasingly some of the material processes are also have shown to work well with students of secondary school age. So back to the Braunschweig project, we worked with 4 different materials. So we were working with cardboard and paper as one. we were working with plastic as another, we were working with sand, and we were working with fabric. And so what we did was find a way of taking these 4 materials and splitting each of those into 2 separate outcomes, but doing that through really, really basic ways. So like, you know, I think the most like technologically advanced thing that we had was kind of this hydraulic presser thing, which, you know, isn't very expensive. By doing that, I think it was a really good way of, I mean, you know, that was largely done with students between the ages of 14 and 18. And I think that really influenced them to think about how these kind of waste materials, or not even just waste materials, but quite familiar and mundane materials can be reworked as constructive materials. I think it would have really, you know, the response that we had from them in also being able to design in that way, to kind of design on the go, I think was a really interesting way of engaging the students as well. Because, you know, we've all been, I'm sure everyone here has been in situations, or a lot of people have been in situations where, you know, you're trying to do something quite complicated with young children, and the process just isn't working out. You know, for example, like trying to kind of explain a scale architectural map to someone quite young. You know, it's just like it's a difficult process, and anyone who's done that successfully, like, I commend you. But I think these materials offer themselves in a process way that's very different, and actually you can afford to be quite messy with them, and you can afford to make lots and lots of mistakes with these materials because they aren't precious. You can afford to kind of think by doing, and I think that's been something that we're actually keen to take much further, by how people think through these design processes, not just kind of pen and papering it and then detailing it very precisely and then embarking upon it, by kind of reversing it and arriving to that final project through this kind of meandering way of like making mistakes and fixing those mistakes and, you know, testing and these kind of things.
Great, thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes, so we might be able to only manage one more question until we get to 5. So in your experience, have you found participants come away with a different kind of confidence and connection to place after your workshops?
I think, I don't know if they have a more positive connection to place. I think that, yeah, I wouldn't be able to comment on whether it's more positive and negative, but I definitely think that the process that we've gone on is sometimes quite a therapeutic process. It can sometimes be, especially for the residents group that we worked in Park Hill Estate, and another group that we worked with. So we worked with the volunteers in Hull for the UK Seat of Culture, and generally the volunteers range from like 7 to 70 odd, but there's a large group of volunteers that have continued on in their mostly retired, who still help and still volunteer now. And I think that when we took them through these different processes, and when we did a lot of different activities working with local materials and thinking about the city through the lens of the children that we worked with, like, they were really able to put their own spin on some of the things we were reflecting on, and to provide their own input into it, because we very rarely come into a realm or a situation saying that we know or understand a new city, or even the areas that we're working with that we're even quite familiar with. So I think it's more about providing people an opportunity to contribute and an opportunity to demonstrate their own kind of inputs and their own value to the situation. And it seems like it's been quite quite a kind of a positive process. I don't know, Akil, what you think?
Yeah, no, completely agreed.
Thank you both so much for being so generous and sharing all your projects and in answering all the questions. We didn't quite get through them all, sorry everyone, but we don't want to run over too much. So yeah, thank you both very much.